Thank you for coming back. So tonight, as promised, there will be more time for conversation and dialogue, probably about a half hour, 35 minutes total. So you'll have plenty of time to share what's on your mind and to hear what your friends are thinking. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. All right. So today is Class 3, Definitions of Hate as Political Engagement, Anti-Semitism in the 21st Century. So we're really going to talk about the politics of defining anti-Semitism more specifically, and we're going to see the cultural and political implications of seeing anti-Semitism in or defining anti-Semitism in our current environment. So just as a quick recap, we looked a little bit at the history and politics of defining anti-Semitism. We then talked about Israel, Zionism, and two definitions and two worldviews. And today we're going to unpack a lot of what we did on Class 2 because there was a lot of information, not a lot of time to process it. So today we'll really be dedicated to processing it while learning a few more of the cultural complications of how this works. So just a reminder of our course goals. We want to have a better understanding of the history and politics of defining anti-Semitism. We want to consider the contemporary political situation informing efforts to define anti-Semitism. And so last week we learned that had to do with the history of Zionism and the current situation between Israelis and Palestinians. And today we want to find ways to encourage people to build interreligious coalitions to combat anti-Semitism with and without a definition. So we're going to think about how we can cut through sort of ideological barriers and fight religious bigotry together, even when we don't agree on what the religious bigotry is. So it's going to be a complicated exercise at the end, but it's something that I think it's worth considering. So what are we doing today? So I'm going to do a brief review. I'm going to put the two definitions, the IHRA and the Jerusalem Declaration, side by side, and we're going to look at the differences and similarities of each document. And that'll take a few minutes. And then we're going to talk about the definitions of anti-Semitism and public policy. So how specifically the IHRA, a definition of anti-Semitism, is informing and influencing public policy. And then for about 10 or 15 minutes, I want to look at definitions, anti-Semitism, Zionism, and Jewish identity. So within Jewish communities, there isn't agreement on the definitions of these terms. And what's become really apparent, interesting, and somewhat even at times troubling is that how you define anti-Semitism and its relationship to Israel and Zionism somehow determines one's Jewish identity. And we're going to see how that has played out in writing and look at sort of the implications of the accusations that come out of somebody's support of a definition of anti-Semitism. We'll have a breakout room for about 15, 20 minutes. And then I want to share a Palestinian point of view on these particular debates, because a lot of the debates seem to be centered around what you can and can't say in regards to Israel and Zionism. And both of those things have a direct influence on the fate of Palestinians. Palestinians play a role in this narrative too. And so I thought it would be important for us to at least consider what we'll find is a famous Palestinian point of view and how this one thinker deals with these issues in a public way. Then I want to come to the agreement that we probably disagree, meaning we as everyone that is in this course is probably coming to anti-Semitism a little bit differently. But even though we have those differences, we now have laid out a series of two definitions that at least make apparent what the goals of each definition are. And so we'll try to figure out where the disagreement lies. You'll have a breakout room, a plenary, final thoughts, and then we'll adjourn. Okay, good. So let's look at the definitions. So the IHRA definition is: anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So that's the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. The Jerusalem Declaration is a little more succinct. Anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or Jewish institutions as Jewish. So when you look at the definitions themselves, you'll see some slight differences, but it's really in the examples that they use where we start to see a parting of the ways. In the IHRA, it follows with 11 brief examples of anti-Semitism, 7 which focus on Israel. So the majority of the examples have to do with what you can and can't say about the state of Israel or Zionism. Well, you can say whatever you want, but what you can say or can't say in regards to anti-Semitism, whether or not your statement or assertion is anti-Semitic. It agrees with the premise that we learned last week of the new anti-Semitism, that all of the hatred that had been expressed towards Jews for millennia, but more particularly in the last 2 centuries, becomes targeted toward the state of Israel, that the state of Israel and Zionism to some extent become a collective Jew, that the stereotypes and ideas that undergirded anti-Semitism in regards to Jewish people and Jewish communities gets replaced by Israel. In the Jerusalem Declaration, it follows with examples either affirming or opposing those of the IHRA. So what's important is the Jerusalem Declaration, as it states, is responding to the IHRA. It's simply offering a corrective. And so a lot of the examples that they use are from the examples of the IHRA, and they're saying either they're correct or incorrect. And it disagrees with the premise of the new anti-Semitism. For the JDA, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. So really that is the tension between these two definitions. And we're going to see how they play out in the cultural sphere, and even to some extent the religious. So the 2 salient differences between these definitions are: if you can plug in Rothschild or George Soros for Israel and the sentence or image still works, both definitions agree that this is anti-Semitism, right? So when you look at a critique of Israel or a statement or assertion against Israel, simply replace Israel with Rothschild or Soros or any other caricature or figure of the Jew, and it is understood as anti-Semitic. And it's an interesting exercise to do. It does become helpful when reading about Israel or listening to what people say about Israel. This debate is about the role of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel or anti-Zionist rhetoric or critique. So the difference is in the JDA, there's a little more nuance and a little more flexibility on what is allowed without being anti-Semitic, where it seems with the IHRA, there's some clarity. Clarity in that most anti-Zionist, if not all anti-Zionist rhetoric or critique is anti-Semitic. And the difference is found in 3 examples from the IHRA definition. So the first is the double standard, and this is a famous double standard argument, that if Israel is being held accountable for things that other countries are not held accountable for, then it is anti-Semitic. So the rejoinder by the JDA is there's the unreasonable standard. Simply because something's not reasonable or even sounds unfair or unthoughtful doesn't perforce make it anti-Semitic. The second is calling Israel a racist state. So all nationalism that comes out of the 19th century, 20th century has the ingredients for racism. When you start thinking from language, blood, and land as inexorably linked to one's identity, and that the state itself is a flourishing of all three of these things, racism does become a part of one's identity building, simply because to be part of a nation, some can be in and some can be out. So the deeper question is whether or not Israel puts into play the ingredients of racism, and asking whether or not it does that, or accusing it of doing that, for the JDA is not anti-Semitic. For the IHRA, it is 100% anti-Semitic because it delegitimizes Israel as a state. And then finally, the argument is of denying that Jews constitute a nation. So for the IHRA, there's an issue of normalcy. Jews are a nation like any other nation, and to question that is anti-Semitic. For the JDA, questioning the narrative that informs a Zionist understanding of Jews is not anti-Semitic. Or to even say that Jews are a nation, and to question that is not anti-Semitic. The JDA will go so far as probably to say that that when questioning the right to existence of Israel as a Jewish state, for the IHRA, that's anti-Semitic. For the JDA, it really depends on the context. If you're an anarchist and you don't believe in the right of any state, then you can question Israel's right to exist as a state in the way that you question any state's right to exist. Or you could make the argument, according to the JDA, that there's a certain anthropomorphism that goes into talking about states, and that states don't have rights, human beings do. States are simply the part of the imagination and machinations of human power. If that's the case, then it's not anti-Semitic. So what you see is these two definitions that that are both grounded historically, as we've seen. Both have a narrative that inform these views, and both are at odds with one another. And so we need an answer. And then the question is, do we, or do we? So I wanted to share with you some responses to the JDA, because the JDA is responding to the IHRA. And so after they put out their definition correcting, or what they perceive to be is correcting the IHRA, there were some responses. And now we're going to start to see the seeds of the cultural debate. So the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism is itself anti-Semitic. The real objective is to use the fight against anti-Semitism as a weapon with which to vilify Israel. And so this comes from Dana Barnett in an article entitled "The Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism is Itself Anti-Semitic." So what Barnett is arguing is that under the veneer of trying to define anti-Semitism, what they're doing is undermining Jewish self-determination, which ultimately is an anti-Semitic move. And it's a way to allow even the most racist and bigoted critics of Israel to have a platform on which to vilify Israel. And so she sees this as a troubling document. The next thing that I wanted to share is the smug Jewish academics and intellectuals who signed the JDA are seeking to incite Jewish hatred, desperately longing to be regarded as good Jews. So as I shared in the last class, of the hundreds of people who signed this document, most of them were Jewish faculty at universities, Jewish studies professors, political science professors. Most of them were Jewish. The document itself originated in Jerusalem, was written by Israeli Jews and Jews outside of Israel. And there's this idea that they're doing this to become good Jews. And what good Jews means is that they're cosmopolitan enough to be accepted by non-Jews. It's a coded term for self-hatred, that these Jews would rather be progressive and liberal in a worldwide context than have some deeper connection to Jewish communities or what Jewish communities value. It's about 150-year-old trope. But both of these accusations are pretty harsh. But lest you think it's only Jewish communities that are going after Jews. Oh, by the way, this is the ISGAP Scholars Support the IHRA Definition of Anti-Semitism article put out by the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. So as I mentioned in the previous class, a lot of these European organizations use a lot of abbreviations, and sometimes they're really hard to keep up with. But just in case we spend too much time on Jewish critics of the JDA, we also have the JDA is an Orientalist text that fails to produce true opposition to the core problem of the IHRA definition, the silencing and erasure of Palestine and Palestinians. And this is by M. Mohanad Ayash, and it's entitled "The Jerusalem Declaration is an Orientalist Text" in Al Jazeera. So this has all happened. All of these texts have been published in the last year and a half. And so the JDA has inspired quite a response from different scholars from around the world. So what I want to do now is move toward local politics. So what we have here is I cut and pasted from the Jewish Insider just the headline. It's called "Definition Deferred, Facing Pressure from Activists, Maryland's Montgomery County Council Postpones Anti-Semitism Vote." The council was set to vote on the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. And so this was in August of this year. The photograph is from that meeting. And so you see one of the activists holding up the sign that says the IHRA definition is anti-Palestinian. So the fear of adopting IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, as we learned in last class, is that ultimately all Palestinian forms of self-determination under this definition can become perceived to be anti-Semitic. That if a Palestinian is not thrilled with Zionism, says nasty things about Zionism, or even is against the state of Israel, that in itself, according to the IHRA, is anti-Semitic. So Palestinians no longer have a voice legally in some areas to declare their opposition for things like the occupation or siege or the conditions in area A, B, and C in the West Bank. And so that's the fear that opponents of the IHRA are sharing and disclosing, that this definition is going to silence dissent. And if you remember, one of the authors of the statement last week, one of the authors of the IHRA definition of the statement decided that it was, in fact, a way to suppress Palestinian dissent. So there's fear. And I will say, just in terms of, just a few weeks ago, the definition in Montgomery County was voted unanimously to become law. So there was pushback, but now it's law in Montgomery County. It's been adopted. So That means it will be used to define hate crimes. And I think what's also important is that with the JDA, something like BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, is not anti-Semitic, whereas for the IHRA it is. A couple of years ago, Governor Hogan made it illegal for any vendor that's working with the state of Maryland to support BDS while they are working with the state of Maryland. So it does have some practical applications in our state. Now, the IHRA has been adopted by more than 1,000 global entities as of the beginning of this year. It's gone up considerably since this headline. But in the Jerusalem Post, it says in the United States, 18 new states in 2022 adopted it via legislation or executive actions, bringing the number of states adopting the definition to 30. So when 60% of the United States has adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, it's starting to look more like American policy. The United States State Department has applied it as its definition. University of Pittsburgh, Lufthansa, and the country of Bosnia, among 1,000 others. So there are some real life political applications to this definition. So there's something urgent about trying to get this definition right. So if you remember, the IHRA came first, the JDA served as a corrective, but the IHRA definition is being adopted all over the world. So I wanted to talk briefly about definitions, anti-Semitism, Zionism, and Jewish identity. The photograph you see in front of you is a protest by the Neturei Karta, which is a very well-known, at least in certain communities, a well-known anti-Zionist Jewish community. And they very often protest and stand against Israel. As you can see in the sign, the existence of the terrorist state of Israel. But really the theology that undergirds their political position is that Zionism is a modern form of idolatry. That when you created the idol of nationalism and turned it into a state, and that the state itself then reflected Jewish identity, Jews focused more on nationalism and less on God, and therefore it became an idol. So they are well-known anti-Zionists. So I want to move to an article that some of you may have read, some of you, but I'm guessing a lot of you haven't, called The Un-Jews by Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy, in which they are taking issue with precisely the very thing that the JDA represents. And what the JDA represents is an understanding of Israel in which you can critique it in a variety of ways and not be anti-Semitic, but also suggest that Zionism itself or critiquing Zionism itself is not anti-Semitic. So what Sharansky and Troy write, and this is an excerpt, so for the next 3 sides, I'm just reading an excerpt. The anti-Zionists know exactly what they're doing and what they're undoing. They're trying to disentangle Judaism from Jewish nationalism, the sense of Jewish peoplehood, while undoing decades of identity building. In repudiating Israel and Zionism, hundreds of Jewish Google employees rejected what they called the quote, the conflation of Israel with, quote, with the Jewish people, end of quote. The voices of inflamed Jewish opponents of Israel and Zionism are in turn amplified by a militant progressive superstructure that now has an ideological lock on the discourse in American academia, publishing, media, and the professions that formerly respected American Jewry, Zionist accented peoplehood-centered constructions of Jewish identity. We call these critics un-Jews because they believe the only way to fulfill the Jewish mission of saving the world with Jewish values is to undo the ways most actual Jews do Jewishness. They are not ex-Jews or non-Jews because many of them are and remain deeply involved Jewishly despite their harsh descent. Many un-Jews are active in forms of Jewish leadership, running Jewish studies departments, speaking from rabbinic pulpits, hosting Shabbat dinners. For many of these un-Jews, the public and communal staging of their anti-Israeli and anti-Zionist beliefs appears to be the badge of a superior form of Judaism, stripped of its unsavory and unethical ethnocentric and colonialist baggage. In launching this attempt, these anti-Zionists join a long history of such un-Jews who wormed their way deep into the tradition and tried to weaken Jewish identity ideologically from within by canceling a central pillar of contemporary Jewish identity as part of what they imagined to be a wider commitment to world liberation. This phenomenon of the un-Jews has emerged most dramatically whenever Jews sought to join with non-Jews in advancing quintessentially Jewish ideas of brotherly love, equality, and social justice unmoored from their Jewish context and their Jewish delivery systems. Historically, the most successful of these un-Jewish movements being Christianity. So these are some very provocative statements. So for Troy and for Sharansky, despite grounding their critique of Israel and Zionism in Judaism, it's a surreptitious way of undermining the Judaism of millions of others. And it's a way to superciliously look down upon those that believe in some nationalism and ethnocentrism, and even to some extent, some colonialism. And that their goal is to weaken Jewish identity by challenging Jews from Jewish tradition. That this is not a sincere move on behalf of those who critique Zionism in Israel. So they don't have in mind the Neturei Karta, although they would be disagreeing with them. What they have in mind are mostly liberal Jews, progressive Jews. And so I wanted to share with you one of the rejoinders by a professor at Dartmouth named Shaul Magid. And so he writes an article called The Enforcers. So he's going to accuse them of enforcing a certain form of Jewish identity and deciding who is and who isn't. So Magid writes, to be fair, the enforcers, so that's Sharansky and Troy, are not saying non or anti-Zionists are not Jews. It's even worse than that. What they are arguing is that they are essentially anti-Jews or counter-Jews because for the enforcers, Sharansky and Troy, Zionism, meaning support of the state of Israel as a Jewish state, has become a more important marker of identity than Jewish practice or any other kind of identification. In a sense, this is an exercise in marking modern-day heretics, Jews who, while still inside the orbit of the Jewish people, are forces that are undermining them. So there are people in your synagogues and people in your communities that are trying to undermine a sense of Jewish community and belonging because of their anti-Israel or anti-Zionist views. The Talmud teaches that the heretic is actually worse than the idolater. For those who would write them out of the Jewish community, what matters is the approved final destination. Support of Zionism as the national Jewish project, which includes at its center support for the state of Israel as a Jewish state. Anything outside of that is taken to be a form of heresy. What the Zionist ideological enforcers suggest is a radical reassessment of Jewishness, no longer based on halakha, which is Jewish law, or religion, however defined, or even ethnicity. For them, legitimate Jewishness pivots instead on identification with and fidelity to a national political project. To be clear, this line of thinking arguably seems to take a higher view of completely secular, assimilated, non-practicing Jews who love Israel than of faithful, observant Jews who do not. Perhaps this is the true heresy. In his provocative and brilliant work, Knesset Yisrael and the Gentile Wars, a response to World War I, the ultra-Orthodox pacifist Aaron Shmuel Tamaris called Eretz Moledet, by which I think he likely meant territorial nationalism, is the modern idolatry. This included for him political Zionism, but for our enforcers, matters of practice and belief have been replaced by national affiliation, exercised through support of a territorial state, and Eretz Moledet as the quintessence of Jewishness from which the very boundaries of legitimacy are drawn. Can this be a form of idolatry? The notion of Zionism as the only possible way to be properly Jewish, ironically, grounds Zionism in an anti-Semitic premise. In pre- and then post-emancipation Europe, anti-Semites often regarded that Jews were not fit for membership in society in part because they were a sick and culturalist people. Joseph Stalin once said that the Jews are not a nation because they lack two essential national attributes: language and territory. Many Zionists agreed. In some ways, the Zionist project was founded on the anti-Semitic assumption that the Jews in the diaspora were a flawed and even diseased people who had no meaningful culture of their own. So as you can see that Magid, Troy, and Sharansky have a very sharp disagreement on the relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism. But they also have a disagreement on the role of anti-Zionism within Jewish communities. And both make fairly provocative assertions, if even some subtle ad hominem arguments against one another. In your breakout room. So I want you to take a minute and collect your thoughts. I just read some provocative material. So the first will be an exercise in listening. So like you did last week, assign a timekeeper. Each person take 1 minute to share what's on their mind. No responding, just share. And it can be anything in the course, anything in the first part of today. Just share what's on your mind. Just of your breakout room. And after everyone has said something, kindly answer the following question. Is a definition of anti-Semitism necessary? Taking into account everything that we just gone over, is this definition necessary? So you will have 15 minutes. We'll come back at 7:50. In fact, we'll come back at 7:51. I don't want to take any time away from you. And then we'll get started in the second part of the class. Okay. So I think we're back. Good. So hopefully you had some time to share what was on your mind and have a conversation about the definitions of anti-Semitism. You will definitely have more time in a moment to go back and talk some more. What I want to do now is share a view from a prominent Palestinian intellectual in a 1979 article, Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims. You might recognize him here. You might recognize him by his name, Edward Said. Said was a Palestinian American born in Jerusalem, who really spent his career looking at Orientalism and colonialism, was a literary critic, especially within the Western canon. And his issue was how the so-called West looks at the East, the Orientalist gaze, how Arabs are perceived by Europeans and Americans, and how that plays a role in cultural exchange and politics and translation and everything else. But he wrote this article that touches upon many of the issues that we've looked at in this course: definition of anti-Semitism and its relationship to Zionism, the relationship to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And he's writing from a Palestinian point of view, which adds another level of nuance to this conversation. So I want to share a few of his paragraphs from this article. It's a long article. The other things that we read from are only a few pages. This is about a 50-page article, so I lifted a few paragraphs from it. So Zionism has had a large number of successes. There is no doubt in my mind, for example, that most Jews do regard Zionism in Israel as urgently important facts for Jewish life, particularly because of what happened to Jews in this century. So interestingly, this is a statement that seems to go with what Sharansky and Troy were saying, that Zionism and Israel are really important for contemporary Jewish identity. And Said is recognizing that. Then, too, Israel has had some remarkable political, cultural achievements to its credit, quite apart from its spectacular military successes until recently. So recognizing that Israel as a new nation has done a lot to advance its cause, both militarily and culturally. Yet there's no getting around the formidable historical reality that in trying to deal with what Zionism has suppressed about the Palestinian people, one also abuts the entire disastrous problem of anti-Semitism on the one hand, and on the other, the complex interrelationship between the Palestinians and the Arab states. So Said was also a fierce critic of Arab hegemonic and authoritarian regimes. He was very much against Saudi Arabia, and then after the revolution, Iran. And although Iran is not Arab, but in the greater Middle East, and that the sort of Muslim attachment to certain types of political nationalism he felt to be untenable. But what he's raising here is that if Zionism was a solution to the problem of anti-Semitism, you run into the reality of the history of what happened in what's called the Nakba. So the great catastrophe for Palestinians, that after 1948, 700,000 Palestinians had to leave their homes. Right, so there are many explanations as to why this happened historically, but the fact is, they left their homes, and so when we talk about this tragedy in the wake of the 20th century and dealing with anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, it's really hard to wrap our heads around the fact that that within 3 years after the end of the Second World War, Zionists, for Said, are participating in expulsion of Palestinians. And that the Palestinian narrative coming out of this great catastrophe is one in which they no longer have a home and they become homeless. And so Said writes, to write critically about Zionism in Palestine has therefore never meant and does not mean now being anti-Semitic. To talk about the Nakba, to talk about the 400 plus villages that were razed to the ground, to talk about the cataclysmic event for Palestinian self-determination and identity is not anti-Semitic for Edward Said. And conversely, the struggle for Palestinian rights and self-determination does not mean support for the Saudi royal family, although we could say for today does not mean support for Hamas or other terrorist organizations and oppressive state structures like most of the Arab nations. So there's a certain Palestinian nationality that is not the same and should not be the same or seen as the same as other Arab cultures or regimes. One must admit, however, that all liberals and even most radicals have been unable to overcome the Zionist habit of equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. I think a little bit has changed since 1979, but this is the context which he's writing. But this is the next sentence that I think is very relevant to the JDA definition of anti-Semitism. Any well-meaning person can thus oppose South African or American racism and at the same time tacitly support Zionist racial discrimination against non-Jews in Palestine. So his problem in 1979 is that liberals were still supporting what he saw as racial discrimination against non-Jews in Palestine. And what he meant were Palestinians. That for him, we should oppose racism in all forms, including racism in Israel against Palestinians. And so his goal was to shift the conversation to one in which Palestinians and the situation of Palestinians could be understood with language like racism. The almost total absence of any handily available historical knowledge from non-Zionist sources, the dissemination by media of malicious simplification, i.e. Jews versus Arabs, the cynical opportunism of various Zionist pressure groups, the tendency endemic to university intellectuals uncritically to repeat camp phrases and political cliches. This is the role Gramsci assigned to traditional intellectuals, that of being experts in legitimation. And he wrote a lot about Gramsci. The fear of treading upon the highly sensitive terrain of what Jews did to their victims in the age of genocidal extermination of Jews. All this contributes to the dulling, regulated enforcement of almost unanimous support for Israel. And so the reason why I wanted to share this particular paragraph with you is that Said would probably argue against the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism for precisely this reason. The dulling, regulated enforcement of almost unanimous support for Israel. So if Israel becomes an idea, or if Israel becomes a place for Jew, almost every criticism of it becomes anti-Semitic. Whereas if you have a criteria by which you critique and engage states and governments, what you'll find is that that Israel acts in some ways like other places, and sometimes it does not. But for Said, if we simply don't engage Israel for what it's doing to the Palestinians, we become complicit. And so that made him uncomfortable. And then in the back of your minds, I'm hoping that you're thinking about whether or not Said's critique here is anti-Semitic according to these definitions. I would say for the JDA, it's not at all anti-Semitic, but I'm wondering, do you think that the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism means that what Said is saying is anti-Semitic? Because it will have some political applications, especially about what's assigned in a public school classroom, because then Said becomes deemed an anti-Semite. And finally, the final paragraph. On the other hand, it would be totally unjust to neglect the power of Zionism as an idea for Jews, or to minimize the complex internal debates characterizing Zionism, its true meaning, its messianic destiny, etc. Meaning, like what Troy and Sharansky said, Zionism has been an important cultural power for Jewish self-definition at least since 1948. And that to minimize it means that you're not really engaging fairly Jewish identity. But at the same time, accepting that there are complex internal debates as to what Zionism is for Jews. Said was very cognizant of the history of Zionism, especially the differences in the Zionist congresses, the political Zionists, the cultural Zionists, the statists, those that believed in federations, all the different forms of Zionism that were discussed and argued among the Jewish community. It's really hard to find one definition of Zionism that becomes the anchor for Jewish identity. But Zionism itself is something that Jews relate to, whether they're against it or for it in forming a Jewish identity. And so Said is very cognizant and sensitive to this. And even to speak about this subject, much less than attempting to define Zionism, is for an Arab quite a difficult matter, but it must honestly be looked at. Because for Said, the definition of Zionism and of anti-Semitism directly relates to him as a Palestinian. because he plays a role in the story, whether he wanted to be there or not. Because being accused of anti-Semitism for demonstrating some sense of political self-determination is going to affect how he orients and navigates in the world. And so I wanted to share this particular this point of view because it doesn't sound that different than some of the definition that we read with the IHRA and JDA. There's a little bit of Magid and a little bit of Troy and Sharansky. So we all seem to disagree. And one of the things that seems to be coming out of this disagreement are issues of heresy, as we saw with Magid and Troy. So if you define anti-Semitism a certain way, that puts you in one community as opposed to another. There's also accusations, and I don't know if some of you saw them, but accusations of Jews acting like Christians. Both Troy and Sharansky and Magid do this to one another. The argument that one side of the debate has assimilated more than the other, that they've become less Jewish by their affinity to Zionism in relationship to anti-Semitism. As we're going to see probably in the next few months, weeks, and years, this is probably going to become more transparent in certain communities. Okay, good. We have the time. So I promised you were going to get some more time in the room together. You can obviously spend some moments reflecting on Saeed's article. I put it out there as something to engage with. But I was hoping also that for the next 15 minutes in your groups, to answer the following question: can we build interreligious coalitions to combat anti-Semitism without agreed upon definition? Is there a way that Natan Sharansky and Edward Said could be in a coalition together to combat anti-Semitism? Because this is a really important issue, because anti-Semitism has not gone away. As we're starting to see, it's rearing its head in a variety of places. And so we really do need partners among religious traditions and among political difference to combat this if it's going to be effective. So for the next 15 minutes in your breakout rooms, can we build interreligious coalitions to combat anti-Semitism without an agreed upon definition? Hopefully you found your conversations tonight productive. You'll notice that for this particular course, I laid out a lot of the definitions and laid out a lot of the articles, and provided very little analysis of them, because I really wanted you to go through this for the first time and without my filter. These issues, as you know, are highly charged. There's a lot of emotion involved, because there's real life safety at stake. But I also wanted you to get a sense of how difficult it is for even organizations like ours to even think about anti-Semitism with all of the definitional ambiguity regarding the term. We want to combat religious bigotry together. We want to build interreligious coalitions to do so. And yet there are myriad definitions as to what anti-Semitism is. And to choose one means that we have to exclude everyone else. And so it's not simply to say that you would accept all definitions of anti-Semitism, but given how much is at stake in these definitions in identity formation, once you make a decision, it can cut you off from other communities because of that tension. So in some sense, Magid was right that there is a heresy, right? Because one thing that we didn't talk about with heresy is that a definition of heresy means that when you say something, what that means is you interpret everything that person has said in the past and the future through that heresy, right? That person changes. I think you know the term ontologically, that their very being changes. It's like when you discover someone is a racist, right? You start to interpret everything they've done in the past and everything they will do in the future through this discovery. So heresy is when you hear something so abhorrent or so against your own values that person changes in your mind. If a definition of anti-Semitism reaches that place, then it's going to be really hard to build interreligious coalitions to combat it. So part of the hope of this seminar, this course, was to at least allow us to understand the multiple points of views that make up these different definitions, and allow us some understanding that we don't have to think about the other or others as heretics, especially in regards to what's going on with the Israelis and Palestinians, what's Islamophobic or what is anti-Semitic. It's a way of trying to find a way to combat bigotry where you can. So it's been a long few weeks. I'm really glad that you stayed through. I think in the future, I promise, and I have talked to my colleagues about this, I would love to do something like this again in person so that we can be together, answer each other's questions, see each other's gestures. But at the very least, right now, we've had a beginning conversation that's going to continue for the next few months, years. And I'm really glad that you stayed with me on Zoom. So until our next program, check our website, and I'll see you soon. All right, have a good night.